Hello, everyone. Welcome to Blogging Heads. My name is Matt Duss. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. And with me today, straight out of Istanbul, is Mustafa Akyol, an author and journalist. Welcome, Mustafa.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's great to see you on Blogging Heads, and I hope you'll have a great discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Really nice to talk to you. Obviously, Turkey is very much in the news these days for a number of different reasons. Before we get into some of the foreign policy issues, though, I wanted to talk briefly about your book, which I've been reading and I really enjoyed for a number of reasons. But it's an interesting discussion about the changes going on in Islam right now, specifically related to Turkey. But I think it's very relevant in an American context just because of the engagement, I'll call it an engagement with the Islamic world especially over the past decade. Very interpretations of Islamic faith in the U.S. discourse, a debate over what Islam really is, what it means for you engaging with Muslims in various countries. But in your book, you talk about the silent Islamic Reformation that you see going on in Turkey right now. Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. My book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. It was published by Norton a few months ago. And as a Turkish writer, I wanted to appeal to the English-speaking global audience. First the Americans, but also other people, because I think the contradictions, apparent or real, between Islam and a free society is very much on the global agenda. And for good reasons. There are many authoritarian regimes in the Muslim world. There are many authoritarian mindsets and oppression and coercion in various ways. But in my book, first of all, I wanted to bring a case for liberalism within Islam. And it sounds impossible for some people, but actually it is not. And there has been liberal movements in the history of Islam. And as I show trace in my book, it's not just about Turkey. But I also show that in late Ottoman Empire and in modern Turkey, there is a genuinely Islamic liberalism that has flourished, although it has struggled with a lot of the problems at home. And also in a few chapters of the book, I show that actually in Turkey, many of the issues relating to Islam and democracy and a free society and individual freedom has been discussed over the decades. And Muslim intellectuals in Turkey have come up with interesting answers. Interesting answers such as the secular state is actually compatible with Islam. Or, you should never impose Islam to other people. You can propose it, of course, as a pious Muslim, but Muslims should not do things like, for example, punishing apostasy or punishing sin. Hence, I have chapters in my book like the freedom to sin or freedom from Islam, which is about the right to live a religion if you want to, because that's an issue in some countries in the Muslim world. So in my book, I'm basically putting the argument for liberalism within Islam. I'm putting the justifications for it on a theoretical level, on a religious level, and I'm also showing that it makes sense to Muslims elsewhere, but also especially in Turkey where I live, and I know all those debates. Turkey is now very much on the agenda in the past few decades, in the past decade mostly, because of its foreign policy. And I know its foreign policy is sometimes welcome in the West, sometimes it's controversial. But the underlying theme should not be forgotten, and that is that Turkey continues to be a healthy Muslim democracy, with its flaws, with its problems. And I also criticize those problems severely at home as a writer also to the Turkish audience. But I think that's important. And also, it was I think, also very apparent, it came out when Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan went to the countries of the Arab Spring, 3 of them, just a few weeks ago, and he said a secular state is a good thing. It is actually compatible with Islam, and a secular state which is at equal distance from Jews and Christians and Muslims and atheists, he said, is what you should aspire to. And he says that's our model in Turkey. Erdogan said that because there has been an ongoing discussion in Turkey among Islamic circles for two decades about this. And although those circles with Erdogan disagreed with the self-styled secularism in Turkey we used to have, which is very illiberal,
Right,
which is about banning,
authoritarian
French imported, but even much more authoritarian than the French. Secularism, which was about banning headscarf, banning Sufi orders, that secularism was not welcome in Turkey by the religious people. But the more actually they realize about the nuances about secularism in the West, particularly the U.S. example, actually, there has been a growing acceptance of it. And Erdogan, I was happy to see Erdogan voicing that experience to the Arabs as a leader who's obviously popular on the Arab street.
Right. That perception or understanding or interpretation of secularism, I think, has always been really interesting to me, because it's understood quite differently in somewhere like France versus the United States. In France, it's a very strict separation, whereas in the United States, it's just kind of an understanding that the government doesn't govern on the basis of religion. Religious expression is not only tolerated, but it's very much a part of America's political life.
Yeah.
And I think I've often made a comparison between different understandings among people in the Middle East and of the word secularism versus Americans and Westerners' understanding of the word Sharia, which I think is defined by many critics of Islam here in the West very, very negatively. Where I think the understanding is much broader and in some ways, I guess benign is not necessarily the right word, but it's just a much more complex understanding in other places than it is here.
Yeah, exactly. That's also actually a part in my book with the meaning of the Sharia. I mean, I know horrible things are committed in the world right now under the name of Sharia, pretty brutal practices, and I'm against all of those. But there has been two different ways of understanding Sharia in Islamic tradition. One has been the literalist way, which says this was written like this in the 10th century and we will do this way. The other one was the tradition which said, let's understand the purposes of the Sharia. And when that tradition basically said the Sharia is about protecting 5 fundamental values, life, property, lineage, inheritance, and religion. So if you take those principle approach, you can actually come to a philosophy such as natural law, in which you have a deep reality in nature, which is created by God, and which upholds the rights of men about governance. So here you can come to a more liberal position. And the thing is, these discussions are important because, I think it is wrong at least it's not practical to expect from Muslims to abandon their values, to abandon all their sacred, scriptures, and then be a part of the modern world. The question is whether Muslims can find their own ways to freedom, whether they can find their own ways to liberal politics. And I think it is important to look for those sources within Islam, and I think it's also important for Muslims to see the nuances in the West. And as you point out, the French secularism and its various imports have given a bad name actually to the secular state in this part of the world. And I know many Muslims, when they went to the U.S. and they said, well, if this is secularism, okay, let's get this secularism, because the secularism we know was about just looking down upon religious people and banning their practices. So I think that middle point is really important there. Yeah.
No, I agree, and especially the relationship between Turkey and the United States in this respect, in that the United States is pretty unique among Western countries in that we have a fairly religious politics. Just the discussion of religion, it's very much a part of American political life. De Tocqueville, observed this. It's one of the major institutions of American civic experience. We're not a religious state or a Christian state by any means, but we just have a very vibrant religious discussion that often impacts our politics and is involved with our politics. And it seems that this is what's happening in Turkey right now, and for the same reasons, in that as the United States became progressively more democratic, our politics became little by little more religious, just because Americans are fairly religiously observant, and the same is true of Turks.
Let me tell you just one little story. The first time I went to came to the U.S., it was 15 years ago. I went to a little town in Pennsylvania, and it was a place full of very religious symbols. It says Jesus saves, and there were religious people praying. And I said, this is a religious country. Unlike what we perceive in the East as if you become a democracy, you will become a secularized, so-called godless society. Right. I said, no, this is not the case. And I think it's important for Muslims in Turkey or elsewhere and to realize that you can be a pious, God-fearing person in an open society. And actually that is better for your faith, because then you preach your faith. You don't impose it, you propose it. And if you impose it, because in countries like Saudi Arabia, what you create is hypocrisy, not real, genuine faith. So these are some of the things that I touch upon in my book. And I think in Turkey, we have a Muslim society to which these arguments are making sense. and these arguments are making inroads. And I think that's the most important thing that Turkey tells to the world right now, besides the foreign policy, which is very complicated. If you want, we can get into that. We get into that as well.
Yeah, let's move to that. But let's focus on Erdogan just for a few minutes here. Obviously a self-identified Islamist, coming from that background, but yet he's articulated a fairly nuanced understanding of what that means for him as the leader of a country he defines as secular, but still, speaking a language that's fraught with religious symbolism, appealing to religious sensibilities in order to build his own profile and Turkey's profile in the region. What's your take on Erdogan?
First of all, I would say Erdogan does not identify himself as an Islamist, actually. That definition, Islamist or Islamism, has been something that Erdogan and his party rejected from the first day. They used to call themselves Islamists in the 90s, but they had a change in early 2000s, and that's why they founded the AKP. And by saying that they're not Islamists, this is what I mean. Islamist, at least in Turkish context, means someone who wants an Islamic state. But Erdogan and his party obviously say, no, we don't want an Islamic state. We want a secular state which is tolerant to religion, which is welcoming to religious people. And that's why they actually define themselves. They thought about it, how should we define ourselves for a while. In the early 2000s, they defined themselves as conservatives, obviously getting idea from the U.S. conservatives. And, when you look at their, founding texts of the AKP, they speak about family values, preserving morality in the face of a, like a new world and so on. So it sounds very much like some of the actually religious conservatives in the U.S.
Right.
I think that's a distinction. So I would not define Erdogan as an Islamist. But there's another element in his, I think, thinking that I called it in a piece of mine Muslimism, which is a default sympathy for Muslims around the world, some form of Muslim nationalism, if you will. And that is understandable to some extent. People do sympathize with people from their faith. But I think that should not make you blind to the problems, or some of the mistakes of your, religious brethren, if you will. And I think, for example, that Muslimism, if you will, or Muslim nationalism comes out some of Erdogan's policies towards Palestine. He feels deeply, committed to the Palestinian people because of that historic and religious bond. That's a Turkish phenomenon as well. It's widespread around Turkey, but Erdogan personally feels that. And again, I think that's not a problem in itself, and it's understandable. But that becomes a problem, for example, when you say, "Oh, the Sudanese leader doesn't commit, genocide or massacres because Muslims don't do that because you sympathize with him because he's a Muslim." I think there has been a few cases such as that Erdogan, his Muslimism led him to a few mistaken positions. But that's one thing. But on the other hand, the very fact that he reaches out to Muslims, he reaches out to the Arab street. He speaks a language which fellow Muslims can understand, although it's Turkish but translated into Arabic. But the concepts he uses, the body language, and all that, I think that makes him a very popular figure around the Muslims in the world right now. And I know there are people in the West who are concerned about this, but I think they should see this angle. Erdogan criticizes Israel strongly, sometimes with too harsh words. But we should see that, after all, he supports a two-state solution in Palestine. Yes, he's very famous on the Arab street, but he's promoting a secular state, to the Arab audiences. And I think that popularity that he has from his guts, from his tough leader stature, that if that is united with this more pragmatic, rational, moderate position, and it is united, I think it might be interesting leverage to promote democratization and liberalization in the Muslim world.
So on that question of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, I know that it's been discussed a lot on Blogging Head, and I don't want to spend too much time on it right now. I wanted to get into some broader Turkish foreign policy issues, but yes, I think it's clear. My question is, how much is Erdogan simply exploiting the Palestinian issue because he knows it's one that's, it will help his appeal in the region, and how much is it something that he deeply feels, or is it just both things are true?
I think there's a both genuine feeling and also pragmatic calculation. I think Erdogan has a feeling to be an important figure in the Muslim world. I mean, people call him caliph, and of course that's an exaggerated term. But he likes his popularity among the Muslims in the world, and I think that comes out of a sense of responsibility. I mean, this whole Ottoman thing is very much discussed in the past 10 years, and people are speaking about Turkey's neo-Ottoman. I don't buy the term in an imperialist sense. I mean, Turkey will not establish an empire again. It should not, and it will never do it. But there is some neo-Ottomanness in the sense of a responsibility for the region. There's a feeling, not just Erdogan, but many people who think like him in Turkey, that we Turks were so important in the Muslim world. We were the standard bearers, and not just standard bearers in terms of leading politically, or Turkey was also a standard bearer in terms of democratization in the Muslim world. I mean, the late Ottoman Empire initiated an important era of democratization and modernization. So there was a feeling that we can still be great, we can still help other Muslim nations, not by imposing anything, but being an example, leading by example. And I think there is that feeling there. And Palestine also fits into that emotionally and also, I think, pragmatically. And there, I think Erdogan is also one thing that is good about Erdogan is that sometimes he makes a mistake, and he gets criticisms, and he can change his ways, silently, and you can see that shift. That happened in domestic, politics as well, but that also happens in foreign policy. Like, for example, Turkey was perceived to be almost an ally of Iran by some people in the West a year ago because Turkey voted no, for the UN sanctions. But Turkey just recently welcomed NATO radars for the missile shield system, which will protect the whole NATO countries from an unnamed threat, but everybody feels that Iran is a part of the deal there.
And Iranians seem to feel clearly that they are the ones to be named. They've criticized it pretty strongly.
Exactly. So Erdogan is trying to have his own third way, if you will. I mean, he wants certainly to keep Turkey as a part of the West, but he will disagree with the West at sometimes, and then he will do his own thing. And I think that is the important thing about him, because I think the Middle East has seen two types of leaders. I mean, in a very, very broad classification. There were moderates who were admired by the West, but who were not very popular on the street, and there were people who were popular on the street, but who had really terrible agendas, like Nasser, who attacked Israel, or like Ahmadinejad, who speaks of destroying Israel. All those radical, unacceptable agendas. But I think Erdogan, he's promoting the moderate view, if you will, which is a two-state solution and democratization in the whole region. But he's doing it in a passionate way, and which gives him credibility on the streets. So I think in that sense, he's, I think, a contribution to the discussions in the Middle East. And probably we should also add this: there's also Erdogan's personality beyond all this. I mean, Abdullah Gül, Turkey's president, also has the same worldview with Erdogan, give or take, and they're coming from the same political background. But his tone and style is very different, very nuanced and soft and so on. But Erdogan, is this leader on his fist on the table sometimes, and that's also a matter of personality rather than just a worldview or ideology thing.
On this question of neo-Ottomanism, I mean, I know a lot is made of this in trying to interpret Turkey's goals for itself, the establishment of a sort of regional economic hegemony. But to what extent do you think, is there a sense of, and this may sound like a funny comparison, but, do you know the movie Rocky III?
Oh, yeah, I'm a fan.
Okay, with Mr. T?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So to what extent does Erdogan or people around him see Turkey is kind of like Rocky coming back after, after this brief period when this upstart, the United States or the West kind of came into their region and started running things, and now they're coming back. They've got the eye of the tiger. They've been in training, and now they're ready to come back and take the title.
Well, I'm not a fan of Mr. T, but I'm a fan of Rocky Balboa, and yeah, that's a good discussion to add, thing to add to the discussion. Well, yes, I think there is this feeling that we Turks have lost who we are, throughout the 20th century. I think there is an implicit critique of the Kemalist revolution, because I think the Kemalist revolution, which is always hailed as a great step forward modernization, It also was something too much. I mean, it was not democratic. It also created problems inside in Turkey with Kurds and other things. Because the loss of Ottoman heritage is sometimes blessed as a step forward for modernization, but the loss of Ottoman heritage also meant loss of pluralism. The Kurds were much free under the Ottoman Empire, much more free than they would become under Republican Turkey. So there became a zealous nationalism in the 20th century in Republican Turkey. And now I think they're believing in a paradigm shift, that Turkey will not go back to a pre-Kemalist era. Kemalism had its contributions to Turkey, like the introduction of secularism, but it will be modified and reformed, and it will be tamed, if you will, to some extent, and Turkey will reconnect its cultural roots. And do this in a way which will not, infringe its connection and its friendship with the West. So there's certainly that feeling, and besides, there's this feeling that the Cold War just made Turkey stuck in itself. I mean, during the Cold War, I grew up as a kid, learning that in Turkey we are surrounded by seas from 3 sides and enemies from 4 sides. So everyone was an enemy. Everyone was a Soviet ally, and we were this national security state. And actually, when the Soviet Union fell, it was Turgut Özal, who is in some ways a precursor to the AKP. He actually opened up Turkey to the Arab countries and to Central Asian Turkic states. Özal's death, actually cut that short. But now there's a feeling that Turkey will again claim. Nobody would use the term hegemony there. I mean, in AKP circles, but they would use a term like a central state, a pivotal state. A state which leads by example, to other countries. It just tells its story. And I think there's a bit of wishful thinking there. I sometimes call it the Turkish manifest destiny. There's the belief that you are destined to be something. But manifest destiny helps the U.S. to be something quite phenomenal in the world. So the belief that you have a mission in history, I think it's there right now. In foreign policy makers in Turkey. And that might lead you to some exaggerated steps, and that might be dangerous. But if you combine that with, if you turn it into self-confidence, a reasonable self-confidence, that can also help your foreign policy. And I think we should be careful. Sometimes, I criticize the AKP foreign policy sometimes to be too ambitious, but I also see that the very fact that it believes in itself makes a difference.
No, but I think citing manifest destiny like that is very apt. But a belief like that, it's part of one of a larger set of beliefs that kind of, it's a way of Turks telling themselves this is our moment, which seems, is very much part of Erdogan and Davutoglu's argument for Turkey right now. We've been preparing, and now this is our time to step forward and play the leadership role that it's part of our destiny. Yeah,
exactly. So, that's the reality. Of course, there are risks. There are risks of being overconfident. And now people criticize a lot, especially these days, the AKP foreign policy in Turkey. Because, there's been an important shift. Davutoğlu had the zero problems with neighbors policy. And now people are speaking about many problems with many neighbors these days. So zero problems thing looks like a bit of the past, because now we have problems with really several neighbors. But some of these problems are actually good problems, because now we are condemning Syria for cracking down on its own people. So I think I'm glad that we have a problem with Syria right now. So I would have a problem with government if they didn't have a problem with Syria of the current months. Or now we have a problem with Iran, not as much as in Syria, but we have a problem with Iran. First of all, we are condemning Syrian government for what it is doing with its people. Secondly, Iran is not happy with what we have done with the NATO missile shield. So there are things there. We actually have good relations with Iraqi Kurdistan, but the PKK complicates the problem there, the Kurdish separatist terror organization, because it has a base in northern Iraq, and we have to do things against that. So it's not easy, and Turkey is not. Sometimes people criticize Turkey for punching above its weight, and I think that has some truth. But also, I've been hearing this criticism since early 2000s, but the weight is always increasing. So you punch out your weight a little bit, but you really become more, I think, influential in the region. And I think the most important thing, for Turkey is that, all these foreign policy things aside, it's soft power. Turkey has become a country to which the Arabs can point out and say, we want to be like them. That's a Muslim country. It is run by obviously pious Muslims like Erdogan. but it's a democracy. It's a country which is very much successfully a capitalist country, a free market country. It is still a friend of the West, still great relations with the West, and still a potential member for the EU. But it is not abandoning its roots. It's not abandoning its faith. And how Turkey can do that, and that's a question that is being discussed. And I mean, now we have like people coming from Egypt or Turks going to Egypt to explain how we did it in Turkey and what was the story of AKP's transition. And that's becoming more and more interesting for the more liberal elements among Arab Islamists. And I think that's the real value I see. How we will really deal with the oil issue with Cyprus, and these are good questions. But I think I look what lies beneath, and I think there's something valuable there.
No, I want to come to that question of liberal Islamists, especially in Egypt, in a minute. But first, I want to kind of step back and look at Turkey's behavior during the Arab awakening. I think one of the obvious points to make about this since January is the way that the Arab awakening has kind of exposed everyone's hypocrisies: Iran's, the United States, Turkey's, the double standards we have with regard to countries that are our allies, say the United States, with Bahrain, and Iran, obviously, with everyone. But Turkey, I think, after some initial missteps, I mean, obviously Erdogan was one of the first to come out strongly for Mubarak to step down, but then with Libya, it was obviously much more complicated. Lots of trade with Libya, and then with Syria too, which was one of the the most important countries, the sort of crown jewel of Davutoglu's foreign policy doctrine. But I think Turkey has been pretty quick in adjusting, certainly in relation to the U.S. and Iran. But I wonder how much of Erdogan's, some of what he's saying, especially his strong statements and very provocative statements about Israel and Palestine. How much of that you think is intended to sort of, make up for the fact that Turkey got embarrassed a little bit at the front end, with everyone all of a sudden, realizing that Turkey, after calling for Mubarak to step down, was one of Gaddafi's biggest backers. Do you see what I'm saying here? Do you think that he's trying to distract people a little bit?
I see what you're saying, and I think you're right, at least partly right. I mean, let me say. I mean, I've written something for Foreign Affairs a few months ago titled "Turkey's Maturing Foreign Policy," because Turkey also responded to Arab Spring, sometimes positively, sometimes not that positively. And I think Turkey did well with Tunisia, which just passed in a few weeks. But then in Egypt, Turkey took sides with the Tahrir people, the liberals and the people who wanted democracy. Erdogan made this historic call. That was great. But in Libya, Turkey didn't know what to do exactly for a while. I mean, first of all, there were understandable reasons. There were 30,000 Turks working in Libya. Gaddafi had welcomed Turkish companies from the 80s. So Turkey had to evacuate them, and that was done successfully by the government. And then I think there was a Turkish business interest concern. The government said, well, we have so many investments in Libya. What shall we do with the rebels and the Gaddafi and so on? So there was like a time, for several weeks, they didn't know exactly what to do. They were trying to mediate both sides, but it didn't work. And there were even some protests against in Turkey by the rebels in Libya. And I think that was a time that Erdogan, saw a danger of losing his credibility, on the Arab street. So, and they quickly just, rolled back and they condemned Gaddafi and they supported the opposition. Now, Turkey has great, relations with the Libyan opposition as well. They supported the opposition by giving a lot of money in cash and other things. So then in Libya, I think they learned a lesson from, in Syria, they learned a lesson from Libya. And from the beginning, they constantly, for a while, they tried to mediate again between the government and the opposition, but they condemned the Syrian government strongly. And I think in his recent trip to Cairo, Erdogan said the Syrian people doesn't believe Assad, I don't believe him, I don't trust him. And, that was a very strong, statement. And now Turkey has put just a big sanction on Syria, which is like, planes, carrying weapons to Syria from Turkish airspace will not be allowed. I think that's the beginning of maybe more things to come. Yeah. So I think Turkey did not do terribly bad in Syria. Also, we should also see that Syria was, as you said, was like a crown jewel of the friendship, policy. But it is likely that yes, the tone against Israel has something to do with the popularity that Turkey seeks in the Arab world. I mean, the tone against Israel has something to do with what Israel does, obviously. I mean, first in Gaza, which really enraged Turkish people because of the civilian casualties there. Secondly, because of the...
And also there was like a sense of personal affront by Erdogan because it was started with Omer in Istanbul, correct?
And that's important to remember because people think, oh, AKP came to Turkey in power and Turkish-Israeli relations went bad. No, I mean, AKP came to power in 2002 until the end of 2008. The relations were great, and Erdogan was trying to mediate between Olmert and Assad for an Israeli-Syrian peace deal. But when Israel, after the day, 2 days after Erdogan and Olmert met for peace talks, just bombed Gaza and destroyed all that process, and made Erdogan look pretty bad. I mean, I think there was an added element to that. So there was a lack of distrust. There was a lack of trust. I mean, a strong sense of distrust to the Israeli government by the Turkish government, beginning from there. And when the Marmara incident happened, I mean, whatever we think on the behavior about the activists on the ship, 9 civilians were killed by Israeli commandos, I mean, on international waters. And in Turkey, everybody, I mean, from opposition to the government, everybody thinks it's unacceptable and Israel should apologize. It's an attack on our citizens. It's a matter of national pride and our responsibility for our citizens. And after 15 months of negotiations and trials and U.S. efforts, Israel said, no, we will not apologize. And I think these are all added frustrations on the side of the Turkish government. And then Erdogan increased his tone. So I think there's a genuine feeling of frustration towards Israel's particular policies, And also there's the fact that Erdogan has realized that standing strong for Palestinians, at least, let's say, or against the belligerency of Israel on some particular issues, makes him popular, or underlines his popularity in the Arab world. And this might look as a kind of a cynical maybe picture, but as a Turk, I am happy to see that Erdogan turns his cash in the Arab world into something like promoting democracy. I mean, turns this popularity he has, he cashes that into supporting democracy. And I was very interested when he said a secular state is really a good thing for Egypt. That was a shocking thing for some people in Egypt, and that was a welcome move by the liberals in Egypt, including some of the more modernist wing elements in the Muslim Brotherhood. So that's how I see the picture now.
Right. I want to stay on that for a minute because that is really interesting. Erdogan coming out in support of a secular state in Egypt. I mean, he's taken criticism from some elements of the Muslim Brotherhood for that kind of thing over the years. But it's also, there are different trends within the Muslim Brotherhood. Some of them, as you note, fairly liberal. What do you see? What would you like to see in the ongoing Turkish-Egyptian relationship right now? I mean, what do you think is the most positive role that Turkey can play, and how should they go about it?
Egypt is obviously the most pivotal state in the whole Arab world. What happens in Egypt, ultimately influences other countries. And Egypt, I mean, after Camp David, and before Camp David, Egypt was this, belligerent country which was rallying Arabs against Israel. After Camp David, it made peace with Israel, something that I fully support. But it also became a dictatorship. It did not inspire anybody in that sense. And it cracked down its own Islamist groups, and those Islamist groups gradually became more radical. Some of their offshoots became terrorists. Actually, Zawahiri, the mastermind of Al-Qaeda came out of that vicious cycle. Now, the new Egypt for me is only good news. In which, the Islamist groups will participate in politics, and they will have to moderate. They will have to become more rational. They will have to, accommodate different, demands in society. They will be a part of the democratic game. And the fact that this new Egypt is now in good relations with what we call New Turkey here, the Turkey that the AKP has helped create in the past 10 years, is, again, very important. And if Egypt, no country will copy each other. And that's not what we should ask from Egyptians, and that would be arrogant, and that would not be right. But I think if Egyptians, especially if Egyptian Islamists or the more liberal elements within Egyptian Islamists, take ideas from the AKP example and say, well, we can be pious Muslims, but we can also accept the liberties of other people, people who are non-Muslims, like Christians, Copts in Egypt, or people who are Muslims but who don't live like them, who tend to be less pious. It's their choice. If they see this plurality in society as something that should be acceptable and that should be respected, that would be a great contribution for the whole Arab world. And Turkey has already intellectual tools created by its Islamic intelligentsia and scholars, and the general acceptance that culture, Islamic culture, I think, which accepts that sort of pluralism. I mean, Erdogan's statement in Egypt was just a signal of what has been going on here. And in that sense, I think this rapprochement between Egypt and Turkey would be only good news for the region. And it will be good news for Israel as well. Because I think, I know Israelis are concerned about, that the Islamic movement, in Tunis it's Nahda, in Egypt it's Muslim Brotherhood, they will come to power, these are not that friendly to Israel, and that might be a problem. It is important to have those groups in the system, make them more responsible actors in the system, rather than having them, outcasts, oppressed by secular regimes, get more radicalized and become violent ultimately, which is a graver, I think, threat to Israel. And I think, of course, Israel will do a favor for itself if also it considers some of its own policies towards the Palestinians and looks for making peace with the peoples of the region, not just regimes which are not there for a long time, as I understand, the authoritarian regimes.
But on that question, the relationship with Israel, to finally really come to that, going back to the apology that the Obama administration tried to write or facilitate from Israel to Turkey, I think, there are obviously Israeli domestic political explanations for why Netanyahu couldn't do that, protecting his right flank from Avigdor Lieberman. But I also think there's a fair argument to be made that Israel, given what Erdogan has been saying, given the trajectory of Erdogan's policies, there were real questions of whether an apology would really suffice, whether the Israelis would, after apologizing and granting some of the Turkish premises about the Mavi Marmara attack, that would simply weaken them in the international community and in their own. So I guess what I'm asking is, given the way things have been going, do you see any potential for the, first of all, the repair of the Turkish-Israeli relationship, but also for Erdogan giving his own history as before Kasselet and before the flotilla of good Turkish-Israeli relationships? Is there some way where he could eventually help to engender some sort of rapprochement between Israel and the rest of the region? Do you see that possibility at all?
Well, to first begin, what would happen if Israel apologizes? First of all, yes, Turkey raised the stakes by saying that we want apology, we want compensation, but we want also the lifting of the blockade on Gaza. Probably that third element also made the Netanyahu government to decide not to apologize. I think they could still, do a good thing if they would still do a good thing if they apologize and pay compensation, but say, well, let's leave aside the blockade issue. That would still help the relations to a great extent. And I think it's the Gaza blockade is important for Erdogan and for the government, but after all, it's important for every Turk almost in Turkey that they killed our people, so they should apologize. That's the most important thing. So I think that would have helped the relationship. But what will happen from now on? I think yes, it will take a while for a rapprochement between Turkey and Israel. Maybe a government, change of government somewhere. And by somewhere, I probably have Israel in mind because, AKP doesn't look like to lose any elections. Who knows? But, it's just 50% of the votes. Yeah. It's the most popular Turkish government ever since 1950s. So I think in Israel, if there's a more moderate government, a government without Lieberman, and maybe not even Netanyahu, but maybe a more left-wing government, if you will, that might change the picture. But let's also remember that this is not the first time that Turkish-Israeli relations are severed. In 1981, Turkey also expelled the Israeli ambassador, downgraded relations because of the Israeli annexation of Jerusalem. So, and that was not a so-called Islamic government in Turkey. That was when the generals were in power during the military coup. So, because I mean, the Palestine issue is important for Turks, not just for even Islamic-minded Turks. I mean, even for the Turkish left, for Turkish liberals, there's sympathy for Palestinians for a long time.
Yeah.
And it took 11 years to normalize Turkish-Israeli relationships in the 80s. And that happened when the Madrid peace talks began in 1991. And Turks said, oh, Israel is talking with the Palestinians, why not us now? So I don't think it will last for, I don't hope it will last for 11 years right now. But I just want to say that, this happened before, that this, diplomatic down-leveling happened before. My hope is that two countries will, again, have good relations. But I think without an apology from Israel, that would be impossible, at least.
So I want to get to one more point before we finish. That's potential flashpoints for Turkey coming up. One being energy resources off Cyprus. And the other being, as we mentioned earlier, the PKK bases in Iraq. And Turkey. Let's go to Iraq first. I mean, there's some who have been predicting, another ground incursion by Turkey into Iraq to go after those bases. I think we've seen increased Turkish trade with Iraq, engagement with the Iraqi government. How likely do you think such an incursion is? What do you think the impact will be?
Well, Turkey, first of all, knows that no military action will totally destroy the PKK. I mean, we tried it in the 90s with brutal methods, and the government is not willing to repeat the 90s, which is a notorious decade in Turkey with human rights abuses, while, there was an anti-terrorist campaign. And there was martial law in the 90s in the whole region in the southeast. It's not going to happen again. So the government is careful not to look like a violator of human rights and be a violator of human rights when it's fighting terrorism. They're careful about that. And also, the government doesn't want to, jeopardize its relation with Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, we are friends with Iraqi Kurdistan. We were not, until a few years ago. That's actually one of the successes of the AKP.
Yeah.
But the PKK is a real problem for Turkey. I mean, PKK attacks have killed more than 50 people in just 2 months. They attacked policemen. They attacked just people walking on the street. They just bombed the middle of Ankara. And this is so unfortunate because just a year ago, now actually Turkey has its own WikiLeaks, if you will, and these videotapes between the head of a Turkish intelligence agency and the PKK members in Europe are now released to the media. And we now understand that the head of a Turkish MIT, which is the CIA, I mean the equivalent of the US CIA, he was speaking to PKK and trying to convince them to disarm and be a part of the political process. And they made some progress. And nobody knows why the PKK began attacking again. I mean, they have some extravagant demands. Maybe they were not met. They did not get everything they wanted. But even when the jailed leader of the PKK, Öcalan, was calling for peace and moderation and so on, some of the maybe more radical wing of the PKK began this war, and Turkey had to respond back. So I find it's justified for Turkey to fight back.
There's always a more radical wing.
Exactly, everywhere. And ultimately, right now, it's kind of like Turkish government said, no more Mr. Nice Guy, at least for a while. And we will, if you kill our people, we will respond. And this began with the bombing of the Kandil mountain, which is in Iraqi Kurdistan, 60 kilometers south of Turkey. It's a very inaccessible region. And now there were ground incursions in northern Iraq. And whenever the government is asked, will there be a ground incursion again, they say, well, we cannot comment on that. These things are done without, It can be, but it will be a minimal thing, and it will be a targeted, attack, as I think. It won't be a huge, occupation of northern Iraq, which is unthinkable, I think. But maybe some additional troops, maybe like by helicopter or something, can be lent there and go after the militants in Kandil. But don't expect a really huge occupation from the Turkish side. Turkey knows that that's not solve the problem, and that will create other problems with the Iraqis, first of all.
And the Cyprus question?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think actually that's that's a very heated issue these days, but it's kind of more of a power struggle. Cyprus is an island which is still problematic, and it's an unsolved problem. The thing is, Turkey has been occupying the north of the island since 1974 because Turkey went there because Turks were being slaughtered by Greek nationalists. So there was a reason to go in there. Yeah. But Turkish generals, once they got in, they didn't want to get out, and they established this Northern Republic of Cyprus, which nobody except Turkey recognizes. So So this was a problem. So when AKP came to power in 2004, they started to solve this problem. So they supported the reunification of the island via a UN, plan. And the Turkish side of the island, thanks to Ankara's support and encouragement, they said yes, they wanted reunification. But the Greek side said no, we don't want reunification. Then they joined European Union. So the Turkish side since then is in limbo, although they are the ones who actually have shown goodwill. Now the Greek side said we will, look for oil in the Mediterranean with Israeli, cooperation to add more, to Turkey's, I think, disturbance. Right. And now Turkey says no, that you cannot do that unless you also incorporate the North to the deal because it's the whole island. Turks have a share in it. And now Turkish ships are on the Mediterranean. But I think this is just, Turkish and Greek ships, planes do this dogfight in the Aegean all the time for decades and nothing happens. So I'm not expecting a military clash, God forbid. But I think Turkey is trying to show a little bit muscle and to show that we are serious and mean business in these issues. Because I think at some point the government became frustrated with the lack of progress, any progress in Cyprus. And so nobody knows really where they will go, but I'm not expecting a violent escalation of the events.
How salient an issue is Cyprus in Turkish politics? Is it one that's discussed a lot, or?
Well, it was a more emotional, more like a very big national cause before the AKP came. So we will never get out of Cyprus. This is the North. The North is ours, and we will support them. That was the line. Actually, when the AKP came, changing that line, they were accused not to be nationalist, not to be patriotic enough. And we know actually some generals wanted to get rid of AKP as early as 2004, mainly for Cyprus, for their treason in Cyprus. But over time, AKP did things to, solve the problem, but the Europeans have not shown goodwill that much, especially France and a few other countries in Europe who don't want Turkey to join the EU, actually like the Cyprus question to be unsolved, because as far as it's unsolved, Turkey cannot move into Europe. So I think now people are accusing the AKP to revert back to the nationalist policies that they have criticized and changed, early 2000s. Maybe there are some truth to that. But also, I think there's a more rational discussion, and people are saying, "Well, we are paying all the taxpayers are paying the salaries of all the people in Cyprus. Do we really have to fund and subsidize this whole country which nobody else recognizes?" So there's willingness to actually support a reunification of the island and seeing North Cyprus, a part of the EU, and a lot as also as a federation with the South. But the South is not very willing to do that, and I think we need a maybe third power like UN or maybe the United States, to help lead these discussions, to help negotiate between these two countries. But right now, I see a limbo there, and I don't know really how it's going to be solved.
All right. Well, this was great. Thanks very much.
Well, my pleasure, Matt.
We're at the end right now. So look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, same here. And my book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, is there on bookstores and on Amazon and elsewhere.
Great. We'll have a link to it on the page.
Thanks.
Great. All right. Bye-bye.